Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Toni Barroso, and I have the immense pleasure of moderating this panel on Spain and Catalonia. Is there a way out of the impasse? What a question indeed. But before we get into the panel, I want to say that this is the second panel of a series of 4 conferences that have been organized by the LSE Students' Union Hispanic Society in cooperation with the Cañada Blanch Center, the LSE Catalan Observatory, and the blog Politikon. And the organizers kindly asked me to make a couple of public service announcements. The first one is that this event is being streamed live by Politikon, so say hola to the world. And that a video of this event will be available on Politikon and YouTube in the coming hours. The second is that the next event of this series will take place next week, but it will take place on Wednesday, not Thursday, like the last one and this one. And it will take place in a different room. In Tower 1, it will be next Wednesday, the 14th at 6:30. If you need more information about this event, which will basically focus on the economics of the Catalan issue, just check the website of the conference series and you will find the number of the room and so on. But next week is about economics. This week we are dealing with the politics, and we have 3 excellent political scientists to talk about the question that we asked at the beginning. So let me introduce them to you. At the end of the table is Jonathan Hopkin, who is an associate professor of comparative politics at the Department of Government here at the LSE. He has research interest in the politics of inequality, redistribution and welfare, populism, post-truth politics, political parties, political finance, and the politics of Britain, Italy, and Spain. Next to him we have Sandra León, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics of the University of York. Her research interests are in the area of federalism, comparative institutions, distributive politics, intergovernmental relations, party system nationalization, and economic voting. And here to my left, we have Toni Rodon, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the London School of Economics. He's also an assistant professor at the Open University of Catalonia. And his research interests include ideology, electoral participation, political geography, political parties, as well as public opinion and the study of nationalism. So the plan is to hold a 1-hour discussion with the panelists, and then we will have 30 minutes for a question and answers session with the audience. So let's get the discussion started. I think before we address the very easy question to answer, is there a way out of the impasse, orally in Catalonia and in Spain? I think it's important to understand where we come from. And that is what I wanted to ask the panel, very basic question, how did we get here? And particularly, and I wanted to ask Jonathan, is why the push for secession has manifested specifically in the last 5 to 6 years in Catalonia, and whether the Catalan issue is, or the Catalan case is a unique situation in the European context. What do you think, Jonathan?
Right, thank you, Antonio, and hello to everybody. It's a question that kind of maybe presupposes my likely answer, which is that I don't think that what's happening in Catalonia is entirely a unique situation to Catalonia or to Spain. But I think we need to distinguish between different types of causes of this current situation. And we could talk about the sort of ultimate, long-term structural causes and more short-term proximate causes. The ultimate cause is clearly that Catalonia has long had a complicated relationship, as Facebook might put it, with the rest of Spain. Despite being part of a political unit that we can call Spain for quite a long time, several centuries, this has often been a tense relationship, and particularly over the last century or so, has often been a source of deep political conflict, and that revolves around a sense of identity, clearly, which is rooted in some historical distinctiveness, but also interpretations of historical events, and also the nature of the Spanish state, which is a kind of not terribly successful attempt at centralizing a kind of Bourbon-style state along French lines and not really managing to pull it off. I don't really want. I mean, last week's session was brought together some of the finest historians on Spain, and I'm not going to try and tread over that ground, on which I'm not particularly expert. But anyway, we know that there is an issue with Catalonia, and it's a long-standing issue. I think a more interesting question, and a question I feel more able to give an answer to, is why now we have moved from a situation where Catalonia often had complaints, there were tensions, and of course at times these tensions were manifested in terrible political violence. But it seemed until quite recently that Catalonia's situation in Spain was in some ways relatively stable, and yet we have seen over the last decade this quite dramatic, what I would call radicalization of the conflict. And I don't mean radicalization in the way it's usually used in British politics to talk about Islamic fundamentalism, but what I do mean is that Catalan nationalism, from being long seen as a relatively pragmatic political movement, has become quite a radical one, and especially has shifted its emphasis from demands for more autonomy more recently to demands for actual independence. So why does this happen? And I'd like to just propose two types of explanations. One is an explanation centered on Catalonia and Spain and the relationship between Catalonia and the rest of Spain. And the other would be to place it into a more comparative context and think about the ways in which Western democracies are evolving. So to start with the more Catalan-centered or Spain-centered explanation, there is a lot of talk about the ways in which the trend towards increasing decentralization in Spain since the transition to democracy ran into a brick wall in the late 2000s, and in particular when the coalition of the Catalan left and the socialists in the mid-2000s proposed a new design of the Statute of Autonomy, which pushed for further autonomy and further recognition of Catalan distinctive identity, but which was ultimately challenged in the Constitutional Court. And this was part of a process of reviving, if you like, certain types of identity politics in which the Partido Popular, the main Spanish-wide conservative party, was very keen to whip up objections to demands for autonomy, but also to some extent anti-Catalan feeling in the rest of Spain, whilst Catalan nationalists played the opposite part of emphasizing the difficulties involved in Catalonia's relationship with the rest of Spain and the hostility of the PP, and to some extent also the Socialist Party, to increasing federalization in Spain. So that's a very kind of Spain-centered explanation. A kind of explanation within that is that we can interpret what's going on in terms of partisan strategies. So if we look at it from the Catalan side, you have the weakening of the hegemonic political party in Catalonia, Convergencia, which sees it a threat to its position not only from the Catalan Socialist Party but also from the increasingly strong Catalan Republican left, Esquerra Republicana. And to keep its position, it has to start matching the increasingly radical demands of these other parties. So you get a polarization taking place within Catalonia. Similarly, in the rest of the statewide, Spanish-wide level, you have the national level parties, in particular the PP, has a very strong incentive to accentuate interterritorial difficulties and tensions in Spain, because this is a winning issue for them in certain areas and places the Socialist Party in Spain in a very difficult position. So there are all kinds of Spain-centered, Catalonia-centered reasons for this conflict emerging at this time. But what I'd like to contrast that with is what I would call a more international political economy or comparative politics type explanation, which is that there's a lot of stuff going on in Western democracies at the moment, and in exactly the same period in which the Catalan situation has become increasingly difficult, we've had democracies facing threats to their stability just about everywhere in the Western world. And this is related to, in particular, and it's easy to forget, especially living in a relatively prosperous and dynamic city like London, to forget how deep the financial crisis of 2008 was and how much of the populations of Western democracies have not yet recovered from that crisis. And this has created huge political tensions. And if we try to reconnect that to the specific case of Catalonia, I would signal that it's some rudimentary research that I carried out with Wikipedia, so somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. that in the established democracies, I could only find one case of a secession referendum in the Western democracies in the post-war period. That was Quebec and Canada. 2 referendums were held, but that's the only one I could find. Since 2008, there have been 3 quite prominent ones. The one that's most questionable is the referendum in the Veneto region of Italy, which was kind of semi-serious, but we've had a proper referendum, an officially sanctioned referendum in Scotland, and of course a non-sanctioned one in Catalonia. So if we place the Catalan situation in this context of radicalization and polarization and destabilization of Western democracies, then you start to see, and here is where some, especially Catalans, might feel a bit less comfortable, and Toni will have something to say about this, but we could place the Catalan independence movement in the same bracket as other anti-system backlash movements, such as Brexit. Even some of the percentages look similar, 48-52. Trump in the US, obviously, Syriza in Greece, Jeremy Corbyn's takeover of the Labour Party, Podemos as a radical left challenger to the socialists in Spain, and so on, and of course the right-wing populist parties we've seen in Northern Europe. And the broad and sort of macro-type explanation for this is that in times of economic crisis, identity politics seems to prosper. We have historical precedents for this. So if you can connect economic grievance to identity, then you have a very potent political weapon. And of course, then this triggers counter-reactions. So for the Catalan movement pushes, then you have a counter-reaction in other parts of Spain. So friends tell me that they've seen Spanish flags laid out in balconies in Madrid, which never used to happen outside of World Cup finals. So, and then we have the more recent, amusing but interesting movement of Tabarnia, which sort of also suggests some of the same thing. Have I gone over time, or do I?
No, you're fine.
Great. So, I mean, Spain was one of the worst hit countries in the financial crisis. Spain had a spectacular, unsustainable property bubble in the 2000s. This bubble collapsed in 2008. The consequences have been terrible. Spain is a country with a long history of structural unemployment, but having unemployment rates of 25% or more, youth unemployment rates between 60 and 70%. It's very easy to see how in a society in those conditions you could get political radicalism. In fact, I think it would be surprising if that did not happen. Now, of course, the ways in which this radicalism manifests itself very often picks up on pre-existing grievances, sometimes quite latent grievances. And so each situation appears unique, but if we place them in a broader comparative perspective, they start to look less unique. Okay? So we have Scottish independence, which is a long-standing political movement. The Scottish National Party has always advocated independence, and it's actually had significant political support since the 1970s. But it's only in 2014 we actually get a referendum. So again, it's very hard to actually demonstrate the link with the financial crisis, but it seems at least plausible that this post-crisis situation is provoking political movements of various kinds, amongst which independence movements. One final point I would make, and this is not based on extensive research, but is based on a bit too much time on Twitter. And that is that I found that the language, rhetoric, and discourse being used in the Catalan independence debate on both sides, but I find it particularly striking in the Catalan case, I have to say, because I kind of expect that kind of thing from the Partido Popular, but maybe not quite so much from what were apparently quite sober, pragmatic, centrist politicians in Catalonia, used to cutting deals at the national and the regional level with parties like the PP and the socialists. And we've seen this explosion of very, very hyperbolic political discourse. España es roba. This reminds me an awful lot of the Lega Nord in Italy, who have this big slogan, Roma ladrona, although at the moment they focus their eye mainly on immigrants. And references to the Régimen del 78. I did my PhD on the Spanish transition to democracy, and although I've probably had to revisit what I think about the transition to democracy in recent years, I still maintain that it was a transition to democracy. And certainly 90% of Catalan voters in 1978 thought that that's what they were getting because they supported the constitution, which now appears to be regarded as illegitimate by around close to half of the Catalan electorate. So, I'll probably stop there except to say that if this is part of a general trend, above and beyond the specificities, which clearly are important of the case, dealing with it is going to require solving the problem that sparked it in the first place, which is not so much the unsustainable nature of the Spanish state, although it clearly needs reform and a lot of loose ends were left in the constituent process which need to be dealt with. But I think the best way to create conditions for a settlement is to have a return to economic growth. And that isn't really in the hands either of Rajoy or of Puigdemont or anyone else involved in this dispute, but is rather in the hands of the European Central Bank.
Thank you. You want to say something about this issue? Or?
Do you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to maybe, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. That's great that you invited me to be part of this panel. Thanks to Luis, to Javier, and the students, the MA and PhD students, for organizing this event. I always say that as a Catalan, I see this situation as a very, worrisome situation. As a political scientist, I think it's fascinating from an analytical point of view. Now, I just wanted to qualify maybe this idea that although I agree with 90% of your analysis, I'm not sure whether the economic crisis spurred identity. I think quite the contrary, that the success of Convergencia y Unión during the economic crisis was to expand their call beyond identity, using the economy to attract voters that in principle wouldn't be identified as strong Catalans. So it's quite the other way around. It's more going from identity and expanding the realm of attraction of Convergencia y Unión to voters that, if you analyze them in terms of how much they feel identified with Catalonia, wouldn't in principle embrace a Catalanist or independentist or nationalist call. So I would qualify that. But it's interesting, the role of the economic crisis, although I wouldn't be so sure that economic growth will curb the current situation, will appease the current situation. I think it's very, very difficult, and I will explain it later on, to backtrack this situation. So I don't think that even with consistent economic growth, not legal issues will be the solution. I think it will be on politics, as it's always been.
Well, sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to say that I was talking to Antonio before. I lived in the US for a couple of years, and I organized a seminar on Catalan and European issues. And basically 10 people showed up. 3 of them were members of my family. And I thought, wow, now we have a full room of people that basically are interested in the Catalan situation, which is great. I agree with Sandra that this is basically a fascinating topic for political science, because there are a lot of questions that we know little about. So Professor Hopkin launched a direct missile on me. So I'll try to answer that. As he knows, because we discussed that in another seminar, I think that the economic crisis in Catalonia, or even in Spain, has basically no role, or a very small marginal role, in the increase of secessionism in the region. Why do I say that? Well, basically for a lot of things, but basically for 2 things. The first one is that it is not theoretically the case that always economic crises lead to more protest. We know that from research in psychology that a lot of times people, when they are struck by a bad economic situation, they become more conservative, which is basically the contrary of what has happened, according to Professor Hopkin in Catalonia. The second one, which is something that is very difficult to deal with, is that the economic crisis in Catalonia, we do not observe the counterfactual. What do I mean with that? Basically, I mean that we do not know what would have happened had the economic crisis not taken place. My prior is that things would have been basically the same. Basically, we have observed a lot of economic crises during the 90s. They didn't create any increase in secession support or any change whatsoever in territorial preferences. And also, if tomorrow the the Catalan economy starts growing 8% of the GDP, something that I hope will happen, we would not definitely observe an appeasement of the Catalan situation. Full stop. So how did we get here? I think it's interesting to take a broad point of view. So I think the Catalan case is basically caused by conjunctural factors, but also structural ones. And I want to take a broader picture to try to explain myself a little bit more. So nowadays in the world, basically there are 193 countries, 195 if we count the Holy See and Palestine. And essentially, if we were to distribute these countries and pick one of them at random, it is likely that one of the country that we would pick would have a national minority or a cultural minority in it. So most of the countries nowadays have national minorities or cultural minorities coexisting within the same state. Actually, there is a scholar, an American, as it is usually the case, that counted all of them, and in the world nowadays we observe 283 national minorities all over the world. Among these 283, there are only 37% that express some sort of secessionist demands. Secessionist demands being very generous, meaning that you want more autonomy and ultimately breaking away. So if we even take into account that some of them would not take this position, probably the percentage would be even lower. So what do we learn from that? Essentially, we learn two things. The countries in general have dealt with internal minorities or internal plurality in two different ways. The first way is basically the French way. You have a cultural minority that could potentially be a national minority. So what do? You basically sort of eliminate the cultural differences, homogenize everyone, make them, all of them become French, and then you solve the problem. It is definitely a way to solve the problem. Not my way, but it's definitely one way to do it. The second way to do it is essentially recognize that you have a problem and then create an institutional structure in order to accommodate all the different national realities that exist nowadays in the world. That would be the case of Belgium, if we want to take a sort of unsuccessful case, but there are a lot of different cases. We can take the case of the UK, we can take the case of Canada, and so on and so forth. The problem with that is that nowadays there are the way I see it, three different factors that have eliminated the incentives to create unions. And that kind of explains why Catalonia also has kind of gone to the path of asking for secessionism. So the theoretical argument for unions basically is rooted in three different points. According to the theories, unions, so forming a state, creating a state out of different political regions, is positive because it may bring insurance gains. What do I mean with that? Basically, if you have a region that is risk averse, that doesn't want to experience a shock, then this region wants to be part of a larger unit in order that if the region experiences a shock, then the larger unit can help the region in order to overcome the difficult situation. In other words, if the region is struck by an economic crisis, the region can always go to the center and say, hey, I'm in a bad situation, please help me, because I'm suffering a lot. The second reason is basically, or the second historical reason for unities have been essentially security. If we were in a Hobbesian world, then unions are a must. Essentially because countries kill each other, they start wars, and therefore the bigger the better, because you will have a bigger army, you will be able to battle all the other enemies, and therefore if you are bigger, you're going to win the war and you're going to be better. The third incentive is basically the one that we know or that we are more familiar with, which is that unions bring bigger markets. I have a bigger market, and therefore this reduces what is called a transaction cost. I will be able to sell more goods or more things to my neighbors, and that would make my economy grow a little bit more than before. The problem with that is that all these incentives have essentially disappeared. Pretty much all of them. The first one is that, if you are in a union and that helps you with economic shocks, you're kind of assuming that these economic shocks will be solved by the union itself. Nowadays in the European Union, essentially economic shocks are solved by the central bank or by some actor that is not within the country. The second one is that hopefully, or we're lucky to live nowadays in a Kantian world and not in a Hobbesian world, so armies have little power in having a say in nowadays politics. And the third one is that larger markets are not within boundaries, but they are all over the world. Nowadays, the Catalan economy, for example, exports most of its goods to the international market. So, apart from all the political logic that is certainly important to understand the Catalan situation, it is also important, to my view, to understand this trend that basically has created a wall, to use Ryan Griffith's terms, of the age of secessionism. In the last 50 years, we have observed essentially that more countries than ever have constituted or have been created.
Can I say something about
Absolutely.
this? Yeah, no, I agree with you that we have to have a broader picture of the whole context, and there is these theories about how supranational integration in defense, in economy, might basically prompt certain regions to demand independence because they feel secure into that integrated structure. They will have no benefits of staying in the national country, the nation state anymore. But still there is the question of giving those grounds when, there is the trigger, when the whole situation, unfolds. And I think that in that case, the economic crisis opened up a discourse about economic grievances that have been there already, but that were more useful for politicians to activate, certain demands. So I think that the economic crisis acted as a trigger of these, grounds that have been accumulated, and of course of the fact that in Spain there are important differences across regions in terms of their economic endowments. And in a period of economic crisis, those grievances, those regional differences are more likely to appear, particularly when there are political parties that are trying to search for a new political strategy. And actually, if you check the percentage of the people within the Convergencia Union that support independence, unlike Esquerra Republicana, whose voters had been gradually turning towards a more independence, like more of their voters towards a more independence, towards more support of independence. In the case of Convergencia Union, the turning point is after autumn 2012. That's the time in which they were demanding a reform of the regional financing system that would improve the situation in Catalonia. So that's an example on how the economic crisis, I think, played a good role, a role in activating these strategies by political entrepreneurs, as we define them in political science, and in helping them to construct, to build up a discourse that was very good for defining their electoral strategies and the shift of the political party, in this case of Convergencia Union. So I just wanted to maybe qualify between the two perspectives, between the two approaches, which things we might take as good from one and another.
Wonderful. Let's move then. We talk about the recent past. Let's talk about the present, and we talk about Impasse as the title of the panel, and we are currently. If there's an impasse, if I've ever seen one, the current situation in Catalonia is one of gridlock. And I wanted to ask particularly Sandra, what explains the situation of gridlock, of these current negotiations between nationalist parties, and the fact that we don't see whether we can have a government anytime soon in Catalonia? And also wanted to ask you about the ramifications for national politics, because clearly it is having a huge impact on polling trends at the national level. So I wanted to know your view on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the question that Antonio asked me to respond was, what's next? Basically, what's next in Catalonia, what's next in Spain. And the next thing Catalonia has to do is basically to have a government, and that's basically the problem now, is to invest a prime minister, what we call in Spain, we call prime ministers presidents, the president of the regional government, of the Catalan government. And that's a problem because of the current candidate continues to be Puigdemont. That has generated a very difficult situation because there is a legal obstacle for him to be invested as president if he continues to be in Belgium. So the most important, the most obvious problem, or the most important difficulty in the current situation is the fact that Puigdemont, the former president of the Generalitat, continues to be the proposal that political parties have put in forma for the investiture, and both the Constitutional Court and the lawyers of the Catalan Parliament have stated that that they cannot invest Puigdemont if he remains in Brussels. But I don't think that's so much interest in this legal aspect, and I'm not qualified to comment on that, to be honest. I think the most interesting aspect in this situation is to think about why Puigdemont, given the exceptional circumstances in which the current situation is, the fact that the central government is ruling Catalonia, and there should be a high pressure to remove the central government to basically restore the Catalan government. Why is it the case that we are witnessing this deadlock, right? I think that's the most interesting question. So I'm going to give you some arguments on why this situation persists. The first one, I think, is why basically there are no alternatives to Puigdemont at the moment, or it's taking a long time for an alternative to be promoted among the most pragmatic sectors, the more moderate sectors within the pro-independence bloc. I think one of the reasons why this is happening is that Junts per Catalunya during the electoral campaign and afterwards has been very successful in building up the narrative, in making the predominant narrative revolve around the issue of bringing back the legitimate government. So everything, the narrative about the election and the narrative after the election has been, we need to bring back, we need to restore the Catalan government. And that narrative is very difficult for political parties to escape. And it's very difficult because in a polarized context, as the existing one in Catalonia, any compromise that may seem as watering down that idea of restoring legitimacy might be highly contested by the population, by sectors of the electorate, which might perceive any backtrack from this idea of restoring the presidency as an humiliation or as a defeat. In addition to that, there is a problem to manage the electorate by political parties, because political parties and social movements have become more intertwined in this period. So for political parties, it's more difficult to command social movements, to command those people, candidates that were not belonging to the party, for instance, in the case of Junts per Catalunya, that were independents, people who might not be so willing to trade off power, or the idea that there is a need to restore government with basically a decrease in their demands, or something that might be interpreted as a defeat. The second reason why there is no alternative, or there doesn't seem to be, or the pragmatics within the pro-independence group doesn't seem to be successful, or to dominate the debate with a more moderate position. The second reason is that actually many voters from Esquerra Republicana and CUP, many of the voters, when they were asked, whom do you want to have as a president, many of them wanted Puigdemont as president. So that makes both Esquerra Republicana and CUP very wary of acting in a way that might create some opposition within their own electorate. And the third argument I wanted to present here for the debate, to understand why it's so difficult to overcome this situation, is that there is an underlying competence among pro-independence parties to become the hegemonic party within the pro-independence group. That's something that was very difficult to foresee before the election. So 1 month or 3 weeks before the election, you would have expected Esquerra Republicana to become the hegemonic party within the pro-independence group. That doesn't happen. And the fact that both parties, Junts per Catalunya and Esquerra Republicana, are so close in terms of electoral support, generates an underlying competition whereby it's very difficult for any of these sides to backtrack. So even assuming that there is a majority of support to pragmatic solutions in this context, there is a sort of prisoner's dilemma, whereby even some of the people having a preference for moderating position, none of these political parties that are actually competing for the same sector of the electorate is going to have an incentive to to show the flag of moderation or pragmatism. So I think that's the third reason whereby we are witnessing a very long process in which there doesn't seem to be an alternative to the investiture of Puigdemont. So, well, what political parties are trying to do now is to find in-between formulas, like having a symbolic investiture in which the former president and his former government will be recognized in a way. I think that might be also part of a more general strategy of building a narrative in which leaders can defend in front of their electorate that they haven't given up immediately, that they are trying to do their best. So this could be a part of a strategy in order to switch or to shift towards alternative options, but minimizing the costs. When you present to the electorate that you have tried your best, I think that's a way to try to minimize the cost of shifting towards a more moderate strategy. And I think that this insistence forms part of this, we do not give up, and we want to show the electorate, and recall what I just said about the importance of this polarized context and the idea of humiliation or defeat. We don't want to tell our electorate that we gave up immediately, but there's going to be a period in which we are going to build up this narrative of fighting and trying one again and over again. So finally, to close this first section on what's next with Catalonia, I think in many other similar contexts, you would expect time, the fact that time goes by, to favor pragmatists, because you might expect that the longer the situation remains as it is now, the fact that the central government is ruling the Catalonian government, you might expect that they may prompt the more pragmatists to take over or to have a say, to raise their voice. But one of the reasons I think this is not happening in Catalonia, or it's taking longer, because we can agree on what's going to happen. The problem is when it's going to happen, and the cost that period may have at many different levels, for political parties, for the population, for the institutions. But the problem is that given this situation in which there is a strong emotional component, it's taking longer for time, just postponing the end of this situation is taking longer for time to be a factor that might basically raise the voice of the more pragmatists within the pro-independence group. And I'll try to be brief to talk about Spain, because that's something that the other side of the story, right? We can't talk about Catalonia without talking about what's going on in Spain. And I have to say that the future does not look very promising. That it looks a little bit gloomy if we take into account public opinion preferences and we take into account what has happened with the most important political parties at the national level. So about the public opinion, I will give you just some data about preferences for the territorial form of the state. And this is data that was released just a couple of days ago by the Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas. 27% of the population in Spain would support centralization, and 37% would support statu quo. So this gives you an idea on the grounds upon which politicians need to work if they want to come up with a solution or with an agreement to sort out the crisis in Catalonia, the political crisis. 37% statu quo, not everything remains the same as it is now. 27% more centralization. And actually, public opinion have been very supportive of the actions taken by the Rajoy government. So if you track public opinion data, what they think about calling for a new election in Catalonia, about dismissing the parliament and the Catalan government, a majority of the people in Spain have a positive view on those actions. So we are not talking about a population that is somehow in a situation to be malleable towards, a solution for Catalonia. We are talking about a very different public opinion scenario. And as for political parties, the problem is that the territorial debate in Spain weakens the voices of those which will be more prone to increase regional autonomy, which are left-wing parties. I'm talking about Podemos, Unidos Podemos, and the Socialist Party, PSOE. And it strengthens the voice, this debate, of those who are not so much in favor of increasing regional authority. And I'm referring to right-wing parties, Ciudadanos and PP. So what happens is that, why I'm saying that it weakens left-wing parties, I'm saying that because both parties in the left, the most important statewide parties in the left, Podemos and PSOE, both have suffer internally with the territorial debate because they are not capable to articulate a unitary discourse in the party about the territorial issue. So both parties, if you have been checking what they've done recently, they have remained quite aside all the events that have been unfolding in Catalonia more recently. They try to avoid this issue, precisely those parties that could be playing an important role in bridging different blocks. Those political parties have no incentives to embark on this discussion, to be part of that debate that weakens their internal unity and that has a negative impact. Whereas on the other side of the ideological spectrum, the right-wing parties, what we've seen is that Ciudadanos has had positive electoral externalities. Their rise in Catalonia, their electoral upturn in Catalonia seems to be having a positive effect at the national level in terms of their electoral prospects. So the question in this is how this electoral upturn of Ciudadanos might affect the whole issue. Well, it depends on how consistent and how strong that electoral upturn is. I think that for it to be consistent, they will have to find other issues apart from the Catalan issue in which they could ground their electoral strength and their competition against Partido Popular, and they have to do it soon because the Catalan issue as a problem, as a problem for the public opinion in Spain, is somehow fading away. It's not. If you check the public opinion data, you will see that it was the second most important problem in October, and now it's the fifth one. So clearly there is a downturn in terms of the attention and that people are paying to the Catalan issue. So Ciudadanos will have to come out with another issue in which it's capable to continue challenging the hegemony of the right-wing spectrum. Well, if that electoral upturn persists, the problem is that, well, the problem from the perspective of trying to come up with a solution for the Catalan issue, the electoral upturn, if it continues to be there, might mean that Ciudadanos is strong enough to form a majoritarian coalition with PP, and in that case, the prospects of having a solution or having a constitutional reform along the lines of more regional autonomy might be more difficult if that's the case. I wonder, just to finish, whether any of those parties, Ciudadanos or PP, could follow the strategy of Nixon goes to China, and then they are the ones that decide to make a turn in the way they have been handling the Catalan crisis. I think that could be a possibility if one of these parties would become the hegemonic party in the right-wing ideological spectrum, but that's not the case. And again, as it's happened in the pro-independence bloc, where we see that there is an underlying competition about which party becomes the hegemonic one, the most important one, is exactly the same now within the right-wing spectrum in the national level, and that, I think, it's a factor that might make less likely for this Nixon goes to China strategy to happen.
Thank you. Jonathan or Tony, brief comment on this?
Yeah, briefly. I'd like to bring some of the points that Sandra is making back into a comparative perspective, because so many of the things that you've highlighted reflect dynamics, these dynamics of polarization that I mentioned earlier, that we can see also in other cases. I mean, I think when you talk about the decline of hegemonic parties, we can see that just about everywhere. We can even see it in Germany, in the current coalition negotiations. Germany, which didn't have anywhere near as bad a crisis as Spain or indeed here, but still can't form a government, and part of the reason is because the winning party is too weak to be able to form coalitions, and there is no alternative to a government led by Merkel, but at the same time Merkel doesn't have the votes to form a government on her own, and the SPD is too weak, so he's forced into a grand coalition that will make it even weaker. And you can see these same dynamics also at the level of Spain-wide politics. So we're seeing the decline of the sort of 2.5 party system which governed Spain since 1982. And in fact, this is relevant both in Spain through the weakness of the PSOE at the statewide level, but also in Catalonia, because one of the things that held Catalonia to the rest of Spain was the dominance, at least in Spanish legislative elections, of the Catalan branch, although some people would find that term offensive, of the Spanish Socialist Party, right, the Catalan Socialist Party. And this party has suffered terrible decline in the last 10 years. But if you look here, further up the road, in Scotland, exactly the same thing happened. So what bound Scotland to the rest of the UK in the post-war period was the dominance there of the Labour Party, and the fact that the Labour Party had votes in England too, and Wales, and that could bring Scotland into the development of a UK-wide welfare state in which Scots could feel that they had an incentive to be part of the same community, and we could tell the same story with Italy in the Democrazia Cristiana. And all of these parties have suffered serious reverses. And when they suffer reverses, new parties come in, they seize the opportunity, they see the traditional parties declining, and the way in which they seize their opportunity is by offering something a little bit more punchy, something more aggressive, right? So, and on both sides, so in the Catalan left we can see this, but we can also see this in Ciudadanos, who may be in many respects a kind of centre-right party, but when it comes to the national issue in Spain is almost more aggressive than the PP in some respects, certainly in Catalonia. So the electoral incentive structure in Western democracies is rewarding the most radical option. The problem is that when you reach the kind of decision point, these radical parties don't really know what to do. So I think in the same way Brexit has placed the British Conservative Party and the Labour Party really in this terrible mess, what do we do now? We promised all these things, but actually looking at these Treasury reports, it's a crazy idea and everybody's going to hate us. But nobody wants to have to stand up and say, well actually, it was all a bit of a bluff. The collapse, the sort of deflating of the high levels of mobilization we saw in Catalonia in the autumn, I found quite striking, surprising. I didn't expect that the 155 article could be applied so easily with so little. I feared there would be major violence and disruption, but instead, and there's this iconic image of the woman in the Ciutadella waiting for Puigdemont's announcement of an independent republic, and there are two shots of her looking excited and then horrified as he announced that actually he's suspending the creation of the republic. And we're still in that. We are still with this promise of something difficult, maybe impossible, utopian, and the suspension of the final decision on where we go with this. And again, I just want to emphasize this comparative perspective. We're seeing this everywhere that radical movements get into power. You can even see it in Trump. He's not going to nuke North Korea, he's going to have a military parade.
How are we doing with time?
We have like 5 minutes. So.
5 minutes to...
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
so that was very interesting what you said about how the current changing political context is actually affecting some of the processes that are taking place, but I won't say anything else. Maybe for the general discussion.
Q&A, we have we haven't answered the main question. Yes. Right? Which is the whole point. And I want to ask Toni, who decided to take the easy one, is there a solution? And if is there a solution, what does a solution look like?
We're academics, we don't have solutions.
We explain things that have happened.
Yes.
I can give a short answer or the long answer. The short answer would be no.
Soft.
No, now more seriously. In order to, so is there a solution? Yes. The Catalan case is not a unique case, and as I explained in the beginning, we don't need to be very innovative in that realm. There are a lot of institutional arrangements all around the world that can be implemented in the Spanish case. As said before, you can pursue two paths. First, assimilation, following Bert strategy and try to Spanishize all the Catalan pupils, and then after a few generations, hoping that they all feel Spanish, and therefore they forget about their secessionist dreams. That can be an option. The second option is basically come up with a federal arrangement in order to appease the different regions or the different realities within Spain. That can also be an option. We have a menu of different options on the table, just looking at how the institutional arrangements are in the European Union nowadays. The other question is whether there is a viable solution in the short run. And I'm a little bit more gloomy on that, and the answer is basically no. Why do I think that? Well, basically because I think revenge is gonna be the main actor, put it that way, on Spanish and Catalan politics for a long time. Let me remind you that the Spanish government has said repeatedly that if they don't like what the Catalan government does, basically they will apply the Article 155 again, which I find appalling. The second one is that there are more than 1,000 people investigated by the judiciary. That's certainly a factor for why people didn't react violently when they applied the 155, basically because these are real threats. There is repression going on, something that we do not need to forget. And most, in a more fundamental way, why do I think it's not viable in the short run? Well, basically for two things. Two structural things and one conjunctural thing, and very fast. The first one is because of a clash on ideologies. Essentially, the Spanish median voter does not accept, is averse to decentralization, especially when it concerns Catalonia. It doesn't even recognize the existence of a different minority group in the Catalan region, which is not hegemonic, I take that, but basically does not accept it. I'm not saying that everyone not accepts it, I'm just saying that the Spanish median voter does not accept it. The second one is for a political competition logic. Going against the Catalans basically gives a lot of votes to Spanish political parties. The other way around too, let's not forget that. So basically the competition between the parties creates a very difficult atmosphere for this solution or for this problem to be solved in the short run. And finally, the conjunctural factor is basically because we do not see any alternative on the table by any Spanish actor except Podemos nowadays, which is kind of even going back to its initial proposals. Even the socialists, the ones that one would think that would be more in favor of looking for an arrangement or an agreement in order to have some sort of decentralization, basically they have disappeared from the political reality and are basically saying yes to all the things that Rajoy is putting forward. Because I think that things could have been very different, completely different. I remember that in 2010, with a few colleagues, we basically met with a few people, with some people in the government, and basically explored the ways to solve this. And all of us, and we were very naive, I have to recognize, agreed that violence would never happen, and that there would be a way within the Spanish constitution and within the Spanish system to fix the problem. And there are certain ways. You can reform the constitution, use the Spanish constitution in a more flexible way. You can even organize a referendum according to the Spanish law. There are definitely a lot of things that you could do. None of these things that you could do have been proposed by basically any major political actor in Spain. That's why my gloomy feeling is so strong in the short run. Thanks.
I have to say, Toni knows how to warm up a crowd. So let's go to the Q&A session, to the Q&A answer session. Is there a microphone? Yes, there is a microphone. I will ask you please to be kind to the panelists and to the rest of the audience. Please identify yourself and just ask a very short and concise question, please. And raise your hand. I have, there in the back was the first one.
I one over here as well.
Oh, thank you for letting me know.
Thank you, Colin Kessler, Research Associate at Newcastle University. I want to ask a question, push a little bit on the point that Professor Hopkin raised, which is this sense of political, perhaps disenfranchisement in many people. Many people who feel disconnected from Spain, and perhaps if it is true that the process is there, if it is true, they may feel also disconnected from Catalan authorities in a year or so. So how do we deal with that situation? Thank you.
Are we going to collect or?
I think let's collect like 3 or 4 questions. I have the gentleman here on the first row.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Cowney. I'd just like to ask this question about the possibility you referred to that there had not been any violence, and thank goodness so far there has not. But there is a flashpoint coming up, and that is that Oriol Junqueras and the 2 juries are about to face a trial, I assume, on charges of rebellion and sedition, something which is really quite difficult for a lot of Europeans to imagine that can happen in today's Europe. That could polarize things within Spain, with, as you say, some people being very anti-Catalan and probably baying for blood, others who may return to the streets, but perhaps not in the peaceful manner that has been the mark of demonstrations up to now. We're grateful if you would deal with that. Thank you.
Tomorrow we have Internet behind with the glasses.
Does this work? Yes. Good evening. The question is for the 2 panelists that were more supportive of the idea of the economic crisis being the trigger for this new seek for independence. My question is on the sociological aspect of the electorate of PDeCAT/Convergencia and Esquerra and CUP, and comparing it to the electorate of the constitutionalists. Can we say that those who have suffered more the crisis have supported the parties that support independence? Because just out of intuition and looking at the maps of the circumscriptions in the last election, which had an incredible turnout, my first feeling was that it was not quite there. Mostly the richer parts of Barcelona actually matched with the poorer ones. So Ciudadanos was the first in Pedales, for instance, as well as the surrounding parts. But I have a sense that those who have suffered most of the crisis, so maybe this is just intuition, did not support very much independence. Or maybe it's a very mixed electorate. I don't know, that's my question. Thank you.
Let's answer these 3 and then we collect some more.
Yeah.
Jonathan
Should I go
first?
first?
Yeah.
I'll go backwards. That's a really good question, and it's a question which is giving me sleepless nights because I'm trying to develop this argument in a comparative perspective with several cases, and it's really very hard to pin down exactly the extent to which the crisis at the individual level affects voting in a way which promotes this kind of support for anti-system movements, including pro-independence movements. It's not at all obvious. What seems to be the case across, if we take the US and most of Western Europe, is that anti-system support seems to be, anti-system support on the right, so right-wing populist anti-immigration movements seem to be strongest in economically declining areas of various kinds. And left, sort of more radical left movements seem to be stronger in urban areas amongst young voters. The Catalan situation doesn't really fit that, and I think part of the reason is because you've got this kind of undercurrent of discontent, the kind of alienation thing that was being mentioned in the other question, which then has to be mobilized by enterprising politicians who are seeking to maximize their support. And if the identity issues do not match the economic consequences of crisis, then it's not going to produce a neat result. The thing is, though, that the crisis creates conflicts which leave everybody feeling cheated. So, from the point of view of Catalonia, it's a rich region within Spain in particular, as we hear endlessly, a net contributor region within Spain. And there is a tendency in the electorate, and Sandra and Toni might be able to give more detail on this, for support for independence to go up, higher up the income scale. It's not a very strong pattern, but it is there. So you could say that there's a crisis, and we're having to pay for it. We're paying more taxes, and we're suffering austerity cuts to support the rest of Spain. And there is a shrinking pie, maybe we should go in alone. I see this a little bit like I came in here at rush hour, it was hard to get on a bus. You know, you see the way people behave at rush hour in the tube, on the roads, there's a shrinking pie, there is less space for us all. People are nastier, right? You will maybe notice this if you move around London at different times of the day. A crisis is like that. A crisis shrinks the pie. Suddenly, everybody gets tetchy. But the way in which that ends up being expressed through anti-system politics, there's no need the people who suffer the most protest the most. Cross-country, there appears to be some part of this pattern. So support for anti-system forces seems to be very strong in Spain, in Greece, in the UK, if we count currents within the major parties, and in the US, if we count what happened with Trump. These are countries which had massive financial crisis and severe fiscal adjustments, whereas the effect has been much weaker in smaller northern European countries like Belgium or the Netherlands or even Germany. But at the micro level, I'm not sure how it works. And I will connect that to the other question about disenfranchisement. Another reason why I think it doesn't really work as a predictor of individual voter behavior is that, on the whole, there is alienation. I mean, I completely agree with you that there's a sense of political disenfranchisement, and it affects the whole of the political spectrum and lots of different demographic groups. We're living in an area where the 1% is taking a bigger and bigger share of the pie. That means the remaining 99%, which includes relatively prosperous people and extremely poor people, includes old people and young people and people in the middle, we're all losing out. Everybody has a grievance at the moment. This is kind of unique in the history of Western democracies because most of our experience of democratic stability has been an experience of economic growth and relatively equitable economic growth. And that has all ended definitively in the last 10 years. And therefore, it seems to me logical that has something to do with the increasingly tense political situation, but it's very hard to pin down to individual level voting explanation.
Yeah, very briefly. So, if the argument was that people who suffer more with the crisis will be more prone to support independence, actually, when you look at the socioeconomic characteristics of the unionists and the pro-independence group of supporters, it's quite the contrary, is that you've got like lower levels of income among the unionists, lower levels of education. There is also a cleavage by language and by place of birth. And that's interesting because in Scotland that doesn't happen. So the education or class is not a very strong predictor of support for independence, whereas here, polarization, it's also embedded in a different type of cleavage, which has to do with the fact that there are socioeconomic, very pronounced socioeconomic differences between these two groups. But I'm talking about the profile of the two groups, but I haven't checked the data about their pocketbook perception. So they perceive that they had basically lost with the crisis or not, and how that affected attitudes towards independence. But at least in the summary of the profiles, it wouldn't be an argument that could be sustained. And maybe, responding to the role of, well, some people wonder to what extent normalized politics will come back to Catalonia. And I think the fact that there are some judicial processes going on and will be going on in the future will certainly contribute not to normalized policy for a long time, which is going to be a problem for any attempt, if there is any attempt in the future, to sort out the problem or to start, a process of bargaining, or at least to attempt to bridge the two positions. That's going to be a problem because it's going to hamper continuously any progress that is going to be made by the two sides in the event that they eventually speak and bargain about the problem.
Yeah. Well, I know that the question was not for me, but now I feel motivated to answer it. So I have a paper with an academic article with Xavier Quadras, professor at the Pompeu Fabra University, exploring the role of the economic crisis in the upsurge of secessionist support. Basically, what we find is that those that suffer more the crisis are not more supportive of independence. Those regions that were struck the hardest by the economic crisis are not those that support independence more. I would love to have different results, because those that work in academia know that it's very difficult to publish a null finding paper, because basically this is what we find, a statistically null relationship. The main factor driving secessionist support nowadays in Catalonia, look it the way you want to look it, is national identity. You can play around with different statistical models, you can do different experiments, you can do whatever you want, but the main factor is essentially national identity. That's the main driver of secessionist or anti-secessionist support nowadays. Okay. Then I want to go back to the question that was answered over there. So actually, one of the things that could have happened in Spain after the economic crisis is basically to increase the level of disaffection among the population. One of the characteristics of the Spanish democracy, also of the Catalan democracy, is that it combines high levels of insatisfaction with high levels of disaffection. These are two different dimensions, as political science like to call it. If you are insatisfied, basically you protest. You go to the streets and you throw rocks to the police if you want. The second one is basically that you don't care about anything, because politics is something strange, it's going to mess up with my life, and therefore I don't want to be involved with it. After the economic crisis, what could have happened is that people could have been more disconnected from both the political realm on both areas, both in the Catalan region and in the Spanish region. Actually, one of the good things about the economic crisis, if we were to say that it was good, is that the levels of political interest increased substantially. So maybe that if we were to learn something good from our experience, is that the economic crisis had a lot of negative consequences, but at least there was something good, which is now that the population is more, is more politically interested, their awareness of politics is higher, and that is also good. That is always good for a political system, because for a political system to work, you need democratic citizens that are aware of what's going on the political realm.
Yeah, but I will qualify that by saying that we know, unfortunately, that the more knowledgeable people in politics, they are not precisely the less ideological. So you might find that it's even harder to convince a very knowledgeable, group of people when it comes, to try to convince them that more moderate positions are needed. So yeah, there is another thing we know in political science about knowledge and polarization?
We know a few things, and all of them go in opposite directions.
Yeah, that's the discipline. Let me take, I don't want to polarize room. Let me take some question from the middle. That gentleman there at the end.
Well, thank you very much for those insightful answers to the questions. I just wanted to touch on one particular point. It seems to be that you were grouping together the right-wing parties, that's CPP and Ciudadanos as well. And yet, if we look at the marked differences in the fortunes they have within Catalonia, Ciudadanos being the most successful party, and they're just completely collapsing. Maybe to add some naive optimism, I'm not sure, to the room potentially, is that potentially they're offering different solutions. And so why is it that they were so markedly different in their success within Catalonia? Does that maybe show that, in terms of grouping them together, that might not be the most helpful way of looking at it, in the fact that Ciudadanos could offer a different solution to PP and therefore potentially a way forward?
I had a gentleman there. Luis, third row. Third, yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. Fernando Calforonda, master student at the European Institute here at LSE. My question is about the tensions between parties, and it has been discussed that PP and Ciudadanos have incentives to try to be the hegemonic party in the center-right Spanish politics. Something similar happens with Esquerra, Convergencia, whichever name they want to take now. But we have a veto player in Catalan politics in the independent side, which is CUP, Candidatura de Unidad Popular, which have been basically a veto player since the 2015 election and also remain so after the last election. And since the question at the end became how did we get here, and we were discussing the trigger and everything, which role and how relevant it is, the role that the CUP plays. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's one more there on the left.
Hi, Oscar Livas from the LSE. I want to bring back the debate to the solution. So I interpret a little bit from what I hear to Toni and Sandra that the solution would entail somehow of either a federal arrangement or more devolution. But this is something that we political scientists have taken for granted for many years, me including myself. But there's some stats now that show also that the devolution has contributed to success in radicalization of parties in regions, like from Emanuele Massetti, for example. So the first part of the question is to what extent that new arrangement, even though going federal, that would mean more decentralization de facto. Also looking at what's happening today with the PNV in Basque Country, where they have more autonomy, but still seems that this claim for self-determination to an extent is coming back. The second part is about dissolution. We're talking about Spain and Catalonia, but what about the solution within Catalonia? Because as Toni presented, there are a lot of arrangements out there, but maybe we also need to take into account the arrangement in Northern Ireland, because it seems from the description that Sandra is doing is we're looking towards an increasingly divided society in itself. So we're not talking just about anti-Catalan sentiments, it's mainly anti-Catalanist or Catalan national sentiments in Spain and within Catalonia as well, that sentiment exists. So how would we cope with these two different groups or minorities within the same country in the long run? I guess that would make it sustainable.
Should we take one more first row on the left? No? You ask? Somebody left, or otherwise I'll go back.
No, you are actually, hi, my name is Antonio, member of the body. Actually, my question is
okay.
My question was related to the same.
Okay.
That question about the social dividing as well. Yeah.
Okay, so let's take one at the back. There. And Luis, be careful. I don't want you to die.
Hi, my name is Alberto. I'm quite surprised that the referendum solution was only kind of mentioned once, and other civilized countries have solved an issue very similar, like Scotland with this. And I understand that the Spanish Constitution won't allow it, but the truth is that they say change the Constitution in order to allow a referendum. Though even if 100% of the Catalans, let's say all the Catalans are crazy, 100% want to change the Constitution to allow this, 100% of the Basques do the same. We still wouldn't be able to change the Constitution because we don't have a demographic way in Spain to change it. So I'm wondering, why is the referendum not really tough? We've barely discussed it, right, as a solution.
Let's take a last one. Last one. At the back.
I wanted to ask you if, well, I've seen quite a lot of similarities between, there are some similarities between the independence movement of Catalonia and the north of Italy. I see that there is actually very highly connected to the unbalance and inequalities of modernization within the same country. That's one point, and I wanted to know your opinion. And second, also the interest of the two main parties that in the central government in Spain and the Catalonia that are being accused of corruption, and I think they are very interested on keeping the power and the status quo, and it's like both are being very successful on their narratives, as for example the central state is being very successful in the narrative, throwing up the skeletons in the closet of civil war, division, the Second Republic and all this. So it's kind of bringing all back together again, a Spanish identity that it was lost. And I wanted to know about your opinion about this narrative of the central government, the conversation with Italy, and the issue with the corruption.
Okay.
Yeah?
You can choose.
Okay, so I'll just take a couple of those points. I mean, the comparison with Northern Italy is pertinent. One, the big difference is the Northern League, which has now dropped the North from its name and is trying to turn itself into something a bit more like the Front National in France and campaigning on immigration as an issue. And then expanding into the south. But of course the Northern League emerges as a kind of tax revolt in Northern Italy against wasteful public spending, largely financed by Northern Italy taxation. And it actually destroyed the Christian Democratic Party, which was this institution which held together the very economically dynamic north of Italy, especially the northeast, which was very Catholic, with the very underdeveloped and problematic south. And when the Northern League's emergence blew that party apart, and ever since, all that we have left now is the Partito Democratico, which will probably lose the next elections, and so Italy's territorial problem will become expressed in the difficulties of forming a government very clearly. And I think there's a parallel with what's going on in Spain. The two big national parties, the PP and the PSOE, kind of held things together, especially since the PP usually didn't have a majority to govern, and the PP was the only party that didn't have a strong presence in Catalonia. Since the PSOE did, this held things together. Labour in Scotland I already alluded to. So one of the problems is that you are having a situation where increasingly large-scale interterritorial, if you like, political organizations capable of absorbing territorial divisions inside them and mobilizing around issues that unified people in Catalonia, the metropolitan area of Barcelona in particular, and Andalusia, right? You could bring them together around broad socialist values, some hints towards sort of liberalization and modernization of the state, not being reactionary Catholics, and so on and so on. The decline of the PSOE and the decline especially of the PSC in Catalonia has meant that that no longer works, right? So what you have instead is the space being occupied by parties that seek to mobilize on issues that can only divide people in Catalonia from those in Andalusia. And this allows me to connect back to the point made by Jose about Northern Ireland. And I don't think Catalonia is at the same point that Northern Ireland was when the peace process began in the 1990s. God help us if we ever get to that situation. But I think it is an interesting model, because I think the big problem in Catalonia is that there's this powerful juggernaut of an independence movement that just isn't big enough to impose its solution on the rest of the country. By country here I mean Catalonia, never mind the rest of Spain. So the logical answer in deeply divided societies is to introduce institutions which force power sharing. The Northern Ireland case is a very elaborate version of that. I don't think there's any need to go anywhere near that far. I think what Spain actually needs, as well as more federalism, is less majoritarianism in its political institutions. The same electoral system which makes it impossible to actually form a government at the statewide level in Spain, we have a minority government with about 20% of the electorate supporting it at the moment, creates also the possibility, forcing the rules of it, for Catalan independence movement to hold a referendum that may have majority support in Catalonia, but would not have been possible had the electoral system not created an artificial majority for those parties. So maybe the answer is not only territorially to share power with the federal system, but also to share power within the institutions of the Spanish Congress and the Parlament, to force parties to have to make deals with each other which can cover the majority of society and which will almost inevitably, and there's a long tradition of political science from Arendt Leiphardt's work on patterns of democracy, which supports that not only is it a good way of creating peaceful societies, but it creates better societies in general when more people have a stake in finding solutions through political decision making.
So, Sandra and Toni, they informed me that they're going to kick us out in 5 minutes.
Okay,
I'll try. Constraints, so if you can be brief.
I'll try to be brief. About power sharing, I will say power sharing, but there is a condition that is additional to power sharing, which is that there is more than one. There is more than one issue of competition. So you need to have ideology beyond, or in addition to the territorial debate, in order to for that to work, in order to have those different alliances. So answering to Jose, a way to weaken those divisions would be to have issues in the agenda when there is a new government that are more ideologically driven and that allow for alliances across blocks, across the unionist and pro-independence bloc, that might weaken, that's the current context. So it's not only about power sharing, but also having an additional issue upon which political parties are establishing alliances. Very briefly about the coup. Well, they are actually not so important as they were in the previous election, because they are needed if they abstain in the investiture vote, but they are not needed to form a majority, and that's the difference. So they may have a voice, but not so strong as in the last mandate. About Ciudadanos and their success. Well, I think Ciudadanos in Catalonia has some particularities that make it a little different party to Ciudadanos in Spain. First, they are an issue party. They emerged out of the Catalan issue. They have been very successful in mobilizing people around that issue, in mobilizing a sector of the electorate that was not mobilized before. But they are also able to capture a more left-wing profile of the voter. That doesn't happen in the rest of Spain, for instance. And they also have a high political capital, something that Partido Popular hasn't got, because they have been there for a longer period, and therefore they have been weakened by being in power. That doesn't happen with Ciudadanos. They have that additional advantage on top of that issue thing, and the fact that they are able to capture a more left-wing voter in Catalonia and not in Spain. And I think that's it.
We leave Toni the response.
Yeah, let's leave Toni.
Okay, a couple points, very briefly. I think Ciudadanos basically they were successful in the Catalan arena. First, because they were very smart, and second, because they exploited the national dimension in a very good way. And third, essentially because the Conservative Party in Catalonia triggers very negative feeling among the population. This is not only the case of Catalonia; it is the case of, in general, democracies that have gone out of dictatorships or of authoritarian regimes. Actually, if you ask the Catalan population what they intend to vote, the Catalan Party, the Popular Party, party gets so low percentage of votes that they will not be able to get into the parliament, if we were to believe those answers in the surveys. Because simply people do not say that they want to vote for the Popular Party. It's something that triggers very, very negative feelings. Ciudadanos does not trigger as much these negative feelings as PP. The second one is an answer to Jose and Antonio. I think the way I see it is that the Catalan median voter basically asked for several things: more autonomy, the protection of self-government, which is actually the problem of what we've seen in the last two decades, and some of them some sort of cultural recognition. If tomorrow you organize a referendum, and also answering the other question, in Catalonia offering three options, sort of the status quo, a more Viva-Max solution, and secession, I'm certainly sure that the second option would win by a large majority. The problem is that this is not at the hands of the Catalan government. It's at the hands of the Spanish government, who is the one that needs to put this offer on the table. Whether they will be able to do that, that's when I'm a bit skeptical.
Thank you so much for being brief. Well, let me thank so much the panelists for being here today, and let me thank you all for coming today. Thank you very much.